This comes from Mrs. Eunice, Eunice Heizer, Heizer of Blackwell. She is the author of the book Glimmer on the Hill. It was recorded by Mrs. J.C. Pond of Medford.
On the hill was a glimmer from the schoolhouse window. When I was a little girl, I can remember when it built the schoolhouse. It was a mile east of my father's home. And when it was completed, they organized the literary society. My mother said, just as soon as we get it done, they're going to have literary. And I said, why, Mama? What's literary? Well, it's where we went one night last winter and you sang all the songs so Daddy made you quit so you save some for next time. And I said, and there wasn't any next time. No, yes, she said it was the next time that it got cold weather and it's too far to drive. I said, you mean every next time's all the time now? And she said, yes. So that day she said, literary tonight, let me curl your hair. And so I got my hair curled, and I went over all my little readings and things that she taught me. And then in the evening, I was so anxious and so eager, she said, go sit in the buggy till I get the baby ready. I had a baby brother, 5 years younger than I. And I went out and brought it in the buggy, and I looked deep. And in the dark that was there, I saw 4 lights. And I ran in the house, and I said, oh, Papa, I see 4 lights in a row. Now, do you remember I was a child that was really dark? There was the sun and the moon and the stars and kerosene lamps and candles. And he said, yes, those are the schoolhouse lights. And the glimmer you see is from the kerosene lights in the window. And the nearer we get to them and what they stand for, the brighter they will be. I knew then that those lights in the window were an invitation to an evening of fun and fellowship. But with my childish mind, I couldn't know that they were a symbol of education and culture, a symbol of better times to come. Now that's the way this book starts out. To carry this thread of Americana through. Then later on, of course, we got better lamps. We got gasoline or something we pumped up. I don't know what it was. I was a child, but they pumped the lights up. And then it wasn't a glimmer. It was a gleam where we could see the window. And then as time went on, the glimmer changed to a gleam. And then when rural electrification brought light to the stuff, it became a veritable glow. See, there is the 4 generations, which makes it Americana, and all this was hinged around the little schoolhouse. Now I'll read just a little bit because I think this is interesting. This is land of the Cherokee. Derby was a sluggish little Kansas town that drowsed in the sun. Farmers' wives exchanged their eats and butter for whatever their families needed, and the farmers sprawled on wooden benches and talked about the cattle and weather. Late news drew its share of attention, and when there had been an accident or a shooting nearby, the town really woke up, and that little old store hummed with excitement. It was humming that afternoon when Matt Ellis, I don't mind telling you so, Matt Ellis was my grandfather. Of course, that wasn't his name. I say I fictionized all, but I know that grandfather's people are not going to sue me. And it was coming when Matt Ellis tied his pony to the hitching post and walked to the door and wanted to know what it was all about. Hi, fellers, he said. Well, what's happened? Bank get robbed or something? Oh, then you ain't heard, one man said. Take a squint at this, mister. Land for every man that ain't got none. And he thrust a newspaper in front of Matt. Sure enough, Congress had approved the bill to open the Cherokee Strip of Oklahoma to white settlers. The editor had given most of the front page to the scoop, and it was described into the smallest detail, even to the race that would open it. Oh, sounds good, said a tall man who was leaning against the cracker barrel, but nobody ever give me nothing, and I reckon they don't aim to start doing it now. Just what I said, put in another. Nobody gives you nothing unless you pay for it. Now you mark my word, if the government gives you a farm, they'll wait till you get it all fixed up and then take it away from you. However, some of the men accepted the article as the truth, and among them was Bill Cantrell, who had been a government surveyor. I believe it's all right, he said, and I intend to go. I studied to be a surveyor and a teacher, but I didn't like either one. And the men knew that Bill was an educated man, and they stopped to listen. And one said, well, if Bill says it's all right, I'll say it's all right. Guess I'll go home and break that 4-year-old bronc of mine. He wants to run, and if I can stick on him, that's a good chance for him to get his run out. Matt Ellis had listened in silence. And then I think I can make it shorter by explaining he went home where his wife, Sarah, was ironing a shirt. And all the way home, he kept thinking of the wonderful opportunity. And he dropped his pony's reins and took half a dozen steps and burst into home. Sarah, he said, our chance has come at last. Sarah moistened her finger and flicked it against the old saddle. Now what's happened? What do you mean by chance? The Cherokee Strip is going to be open, sure enough, and we can get us a home. Now, she'd learned long ago it was useless to get excited, so she proceeded to finish. But Sarah, he said, this is the real thing. The land will be opened by a run, and everybody will have an equal chance. It's a great country, good rich land where the grass grows as high as a horse's flanks. When it's plowed and weathered, it'll grow anything. There'll soon be schools and churches, and there'll be no landlords to torment us. We'll do as we please and build us a home in the new country. Sarah refused to be enthused. What country? She asked. And he hurried on to explain. The Cherokee land, Sarah, it's a strip of land just south of the line where Pete and the other cattlemen have grazed their cattle. It's about 50 miles wide and more than 250 long, some of the best land that ever laid outdoors. Government men are surveying it. It will be open in September. Too good to be so, Sarah announced as she went to change yards. You better put that pony up, he's going off. Now she deliberately let Matt think that she knew nothing of that land south of the 37th parallel, when actually she knew a great deal about it. She'd studied history. She knew it had been crossed by Coronado and his men, explored by French and Spanish parties. And then she knew about the Cherokee Indians, that they had developed a degree of culture that exceeded any of the other 5 civilized tribes. Even more than that, she learned in school was what her Uncle Pete had been called, which was really her cousin. For many years, Pete had driven his great herd of longhorns down the Chisholm Trail every spring and back again in the fall, then on to the market of Abilene. He had grown rich off the country, but he had never learned to like it. Why, it's a hard lot, he said. It's a hard man. Where the winter winds howl and the snow piles deep, the rattlesnake shakes his coils and the coyote yelps on the lonesome prairie. It ain't even fit for an Injun to live in, let alone a white man. Buzzards is about the only thing that don't starve to death when the rains don't come and the creek dries up and the grass dies. Now, she was playing for time. She had come from Indiana in a covered wagon with 5 little children, and she endured such hardships she didn't think she would ever do that again. And she had made him promise her, and the promise was this: if you'll come and go to Kansas with me, there'll be no more moving round. So this goes on, and for a while he's not going, but Joe, his grown son, is going. And then Sarah, being a Christian woman, prayed for guidance, and she changed her mind completely. And then one evening, with the characteristic manner she had, she walked up to her husband, kissed him on the face, and put her hands on his cheek and said, Matt, you get your traps together. You're going to make that run. I thought that was interesting. Now the run, that was the first, opportunity knocks, and the next one is the big day, I believe. or the great day, anyway, the big event. It was the day of the race. Now that's really exciting, folks, but it don't mean much unless you read it all, and I don't have time to do that. So I'll just not do that. But they all went down, and the first night they camped on the Ninsquam River. And there was quite a few people camped there with buggies and surreys and on horses and wagons. Oh, it must have been a great sight. And it said the horses were whinnying and the bacon was frying and the men were herding their horses and feeding them. It must have been quite a bunch. And by the next night they were camped on Bluff Creek. And that night, after they had crawled under the wagon and laid down, oh, the dust was so thick, and somebody complained about a woman because they were eating bacon, and she cried and said, well, if the good Lord didn't make good dirt, what kind did he make? And just then, there was a man came out of the darkness, and it was this cousin Pete that they had talked about. And he was so glad to see them, and he wasn't exactly a relative, but he had taken up at their home as people used to do. And he called a man an uncle, and he said, when you're going over, how are you going to get over the creek? He said, look at those old bluffs on Bluff Creek. They said, well, we haven't found anywhere now where we think we can cross. And he said, well, I'll tell you, your folks awful good to me, and I'm going to put you wise to something. You go downstream here as far till you come to a big cottonwood tree, and about 100 yards beyond that is a ford that you can just get over easily. And so then he walked on. They said, are you going to make the run in the morning? He said, no. Oh, he said he might catch the train and ride down because it was going to be near to the gate of horses, but he didn't care about any farm that land anyway. Wasn't worth anything. So the next morning when they woke up, why, Joe said to his father, oh, what about that? What do you think about what he told us? Well, he said, won't hurt anything to try it. So they got in the wagon and started down with Joe's pony on behind. And sure enough, there was the tree. And said, well, I wonder how he knew that. And Matt said, well, I wouldn't be much surprised if Peach brought out a lot of cattle that he didn't bring out to the Cherokee or the Chisholm Trail or any other trail. And the boy didn't just understand what his father meant. But we'll forget that right now and let on. And soon after the whistle flew and the guns were fired, why, Matt in the wagon gave the old cow horses the lines and urged them, and they were really frightened, and they ran, and they made it down and up without hardly pause, because they had found a good ford. And so then Joe, of course, his horse was well trained, and he spurred on, and when he got down around Kremlin, he said where he reached back and he could detect that in his horse's flank a thump or a throb that denoted exhaustion. So he jumped and stuck his stake. And he said he looked around and looked like a canary who had starved to death. But he sat down there and he began to look around. Finally, he found the cornerstone with the number on it. It wasn't very long till he saw a boy coming across. And this boy said, howdy, mister, looks like we're neighbors. I'm Wilson. And they shook hands, and they went to find his stone, and they had the same number, so they had a contest. This boy was real young. My father marveled that he was old enough to have made the race. And he was kiddish looking. And he said, well, come in and sit a while. So come sit down. And then he started a make-believe game. Come on in and sit down. Sit on the sofa if you want to. It isn't very clean, but it's just the best I've got. And the other kid, he picked up, I will do that, mister. I'll sit here right at the door if you don't mind. By that time, it was evening. And it had been hot, and the sun had beamed, and the soot had blown because the soldiers had burned it off, you know. And they sat down there, those two weary boys sat down in the dirt. way out in the middle of nowhere. They hadn't had food since morning, neither had they had a drink of water. Then there was a boy came by with a barrel of water in an old dilapidated buggy, and they gave him a dime for a tin cup full of river water, which, he said, instead of easing our appetite, it just made us all thirstier. And two hearts dropped. Two young men sitting there, they were hungry, they were thirsty, they were worried, they were discouraged. And then, in the night, the boy said, "Oh, I wish I hadn't come. Nancy didn't want me to come. It seemed like we couldn't get ahead. I wish I was back. If my horse hadn't got away, I'd hightail it out of here." And then they heard the cluck of an old wagon. And Joe said, "Listen, I hear something." Oh, he said, you just imagine you hear something. He said, "I hear a wagon, can't you hear?" And then they thought they did, and then it died down. And it said two hearts dropped down clear into the dust. They were so discouraged. And then pretty soon they heard a faint nicker. A horse neighed in the distance, and the pony that Joe had rode in threw up his head and answered. And he said, "Oh, that's Paul coming." He said, "You know, they might fool people, but they can't fool," what was his horse's name, Herbert? I forgot. But
Nig.
Old Nig, yes, he was a black pony. But they can't fool old Nig, because he'd heard them and he answered. You know how horses would be. And it wasn't very long till the wagon came in. And old Joe said, "You know, I can taste that good old Kansas water now." He was so thirsty. He says, "For in that wagon there's a whole barrel of it." And when the father came up, why, he unhitched and he watered his horses out of the barrel, and he handed the boys a wash tub filled with food with another wash tub over it and a whole gallon of water. And they sat and ate, and the old man said, "Well, when I saw a horse fall in front of me, and it's a woman was in there, her and her child, I forgot I was in a race, and I said, I won't kill my horses off, I won't abuse my horses for any farm, I should have stayed home with Sarah." But it was too late to do that then, so he said, "Up the road, I just stopped and fed my horses and ate a lunch." Well, when they got through eating, why, the young man said, "Well, I guess I'll go punch up my feather bed and go to bed." They said, "Well, bunk here with us." So they spread their blankets. And the next morning, Joe said, "I think one or the other of us better say give or take, and we'll just divide this land and take an 80 apiece." And the boy said, "That'll suit me. Now you say." And Joe had a little money in his pocket because he'd been working out. Come find out later he had $10. But he was afraid, he wasn't afraid of selling, he's afraid of buying, so he wouldn't name it. So they sat there, and pretty soon he said, "Oh, I've just decided this old land isn't worth what's going to cost me. I don't want to ride Eunice to pile on it, but you can have it, and welcome. I don't want it." Well, the boy protested that he couldn't pay for it, but my father was, oh, you know how discouraged you could get. So he climbed up in the wagon, and but first he went and found this man's horse. See, he got on his horse, and this other horse had run enough the day before. He didn't put up any run. He came and was caught. And so my grandfather said, "Well, if you're discouraged, you can ride out with us." And he said, "No, I guess if I do, then I wouldn't have any way to farm next spring. I'll just stay. My brother made the race. Maybe he'll find me pretty soon." So when they started out, they took a loaf of bread and wrapped it in a feed sack and took it to this man, and he was sitting with his head down on his knees in the dirt, and they gave him the bread, and a bucket of water and some oats for his horse, and then said, well, goodbye, neighbor. And they said he got up and accepted the bread, and when they looked back, he was hugging the loaf of bread to his breast with big tears making streaks down his dirty cheeks. So that was the last of that. On the way home, our folks came to a man who was sitting on a hump, and he was spitting tobacco juice at a lizard that changed colors, and he was wrapping up his ankle in a dirty old gunny sack. And they stopped and said, howdy, sir, looks like you got you a farm. Oh, yeah. Why, they said, this is a good farm. Upland for your wheat and lowland for your corn, and a creek with water in it for your stuff. Said, oh, yeah, creek with about a barrel full of water, and it's just as muddy as hell. Why, he said, if I could catch my horse, no, I couldn't ride clear back to Indiana with this foot, but if I had some way to get back to Indiana, I'd go back. And they said, well, this is good land. How about selling or swapping it? Well, I guess that'd just be fine. I'd sure like to get rid of it. I guess since it's good land, you said it ought to be worth $1 an acre, didn't you? Well, my grandfather said, yes, it ought to be worth that, but we don't have $160. I said, how about trading it for the team and wagon? Well, he said, they ain't worth $160. No. Granddad said they're not, but he said, I allow the horses worth $40 a piece, and maybe the old wagon's worth $20, $30, whatever it's worth to you. Well, he said, that still ain't $160, though. Well, said, have you got anything else? My husband, beg your pardon. My father, who was the young man, said, well, I've got a $10 bill. Well, that still ain't enough. What else you got you can throw in? And my father said, well, we've got an old shotgun, but it's broke, it won't shoot. But I throw it in and I pull out. So that's the way my parents got their place. And my grandfather got the place. So they took out the feed and just kept enough for Joe's horse, and the rest they put into the wagon as a farewell gift to Dennis and Dolly. Now that was the beginning of hard times when they stayed there. They built a dugout down by the creek, and they had awfully hard times. But my grandfather was a good carpenter, and soon he began building, and Joe had found his childhood sweetheart, and they had come to the Strip too, and he was in a hurry to get married, so then they built him a house. They called him a house. Of course, they were just a prairie shack. And now I told you about the dimmer on the hill. And we had spelling bees and husking bees and apple parings. And on the prairie near the building stood a big old elm tree that was nobody knew how old. It was alone. It was quite a landmark, so we called the schoolhouse Lone Elm. Now I'm going to skip over some because, as I say, I'll just have to hit the high points. Now there is one chapter in here that is chapter tragedy. I didn't want to put it in, but if it is going to run the thread of Americana through it, these tragedies had to be told, because in the early days of the Strip, it was a land of tragedy. Smallpox broke out, one thing and then another. There were no doctors. There was midwives that took care of the babies, but many babies died at birth. And my father used to tell about a neighbor that had several children, had a baby stillborn, and he said, oh, we fellers, that used to be the way they talked. We went over and stood with our old caps in our hands asking to do something. And he said, boys, if you will, go over in the pasture, pick out a place that drains well, and dig a grave, and we'll bury the baby. And that was the first grave in Spring Creek Cemetery, and I guess there's 200 there now. But that was the first grave dug there. And you know, when my father grew old, and there was various discussion about where he would like to be buried, he said, I want to be buried right out there where I helped dig the first grave. So that's where we put our father away. But I didn't like that on tragedy, but I remember that I was about 5 years old. Grandfather Jones came across the pasture and said that 2 of his family were down with smallpox. And they were just then getting the serum or the vaccination. And I can remember that my father and mother and my baby brother and I walked across the pasture to grandfather's house and got our shots standing out around the buggy. They didn't call them shots then, I guess they were scrapes. But anyway, we got our injections. And 2 of the girls had had smallpox, and they didn't take it. And one of the boys had it, and when he came out of it, one of his eyes were blinded, and he never quite grew up. That was some of the tragedies of the strip. But it had its good days too. For one thing, now this book, our minister says, but that's a religious book. I told you it was a conglomeration. But this tells about how the faith that these people had in God sustained them through all this. And it tells about, you know, where Paul said he knew that neither height nor depth nor this or that could take our faith way down to God. And that is the reason that they survived. And they would get pretty discouraged when there was a failure, but what one had, they all had. They were one for one and one for all, because they couldn't have survived if they hadn't been. There's the story of a couple of rich men that came into the strip. That is, they were well-to-do by the standards then. And they helped quite a lot to maintain this togetherness that meant survival. Now, this is quite a bit later, but it was the first automobile we saw. And it's the story of a horse, and I'll have to tell you a joke on myself. It has a picture of the horse in here. And when I went on television with my book, why the woman, the MC, said, I didn't know when she was going to pop at me and said, oh, tell us about this horse. Well, I wanted to tell about the horse. I wanted to say he was an outlaw or a scoundrel or a rascal. Did you ever have your tongue tied and you couldn't think of any name like that? Mine did. I said, oh, that horse was a desperado. Well, they lied. So then afterwards, when I talked about the horse, I just called him a desperado. And when I got home, my husband laughed and he said, well, if they had seen that horse when he got scared and had one of these tantrums, they would have known he was a desperado because he was desperate. Now this comes a little later on, I guess. I guess I must have been 10 years old. We had a new telephone, and one night it rang. I remember my father and little brother were playing Fox and Goose. They used to make boards they played that on. And my mother was sewing copyright, and that thing rang. We hadn't had it very long. And Mother ran to the phone. Oh, yes, she said, we're all right. Oh, I never looked because it's a new thing. We'll have to go see it. And so she went home and saw that Dr. Max got an automobile. Now, we read in papers and we knew what they were about, but didn't see one. Well, I declare, Father, it's plain. I wonder what they'll do next. 20 years ago, we never thought of all these newfangled things. Now we have a man who brings our mail, a machine that lets us stay in our house and talk to people in theirs, an instrument that plays beautiful music, and now an automobile. We'll never see that much progress in another 20 years. Then it was just a little while till Father was combining the repairs. It was harvest time, and the office, my mother and I would go to town and get the repairs, which we loved to drive and go. We always ran away, but then that didn't matter. We were younger and we didn't mind camping. But for some reason we hadn't seen the machine, and we jogged along that day for about a mile and a half going west, and on top of the hill, I caught a glimpse of a strange object on another hill, a mile ahead. Oh, look, I called out. Look at that thing. It looks like a buggy without any horses. Mother smiled at me. I'll bet that's Dr. Mack's automobile. Old Baldy must have seen it about the same time because he began to snort and swing his head. Mother pulled up on the lines and she said, Baldy'll be scared to death of us. Let us get him unhitched. We jumped out and got the horse loose from the buggy as quickly as possible. Then we took him over and tied him with the halter over the bridle with a lot of knots to a brand new telephone pole. We jumped out and got him away just as quick and pulled the buggy out of the road, and by this time the thing was right on us. As he came even with us, Dr. Mack turned a bent rod on the side of the vehicle, tipped his straw hat to us, and spoke, and then he went chugging down the road, leaving us standing with our mouths wide open. A noise behind us drew our attention, and we looked back to see old Baldy snorting and trying to climb that telephone pole. When the automobile turned a corner, we tried to quiet our horse, but when we approached him, he reared and snorted, and it was an hour before we got him back between the shafts. Well, Mother said when we got in, I guess we'd better go back home. If we go on to town, we'll meet that thing going back, and I sure don't want to go through with all this again. I didn't say anything, but I still remember how the nickel that lay in my sweater pocket threatened to burn a hole in it. Father was very nice about repairs. Never mind, he said, you did the right thing. We'll never have any peace as long as that thing's in the neighborhood. The time may come when they're used, but we'll never live to see it. Now my story won't be complete unless I tell you that Father lived to own several nice cars, and he drove them just as easily and as casually as he used to drive old Baldy, but not as cheaply, of course, because sometimes when the pastures were good, old Baldy didn't come up for his feeding of oats, but gasoline was 10 cents a gallon. Now that takes us on to something quite a bit later. I don't want to tire you folks out, so I'm going to just tell you one more little story. This is full of those silly things. Things that I remember that I kept track of. I call them anecdotes or human interest stories. If you'll notice in the front of the book, I have a whole page that I have sold previous to the books being published. Then I had to call in those copyrights. All of these have sold. But this one, I think, is something that you'll remember because it is funny. Now, this came about several years later. I told you this was a progressive book. It goes from the days of the Cherokee Strip to today. And this was after Herbert and I were married. We had 3 little children. And we were talking one day, and my husband came in. He wore a big old felt hat, and he threw it on the table, and he said, now, guess what? And I said, well, what? Some darn thief took every one of Bill and Annie's chickens last night. Those were our neighbors. Oh, I said, where were they? Well, they went to town for a few minutes. And I said, and here it was, bright moonlight, wasn't it? No, he said it wasn't moonlight, but if I had known that, I'd have been down there. He said if Bill had been home, they would have took those chickens. You know, that made me scared just a little. I didn't know what kind of a husband I had in case of danger. I didn't know whether he made himself liable to attack or not. But we had a bunch of chickens, and he was grooming them for the fair. They were big white rocks. Oh, they were beautiful cows. And we talked about this, and I said, well, I'm glad Bill was gone because the thief might have killed him. And Herbert said, no, if he'd have been there, they wouldn't have taken him. Well, I said, if they'd got caught, I said, any man that would steal a woman's chickens would kill a man to get away. Well, I could see he didn't like that very much. Then it come along, oh, it was a hot night in August. Have you ever lived on a farm when we didn't used to have any? always banned with the newspaper, and we slept outdoors anyway to get some rest. But our house was terribly hot that night. I just couldn't get to sleep. And finally I dozed off, and then I thought I heard something. And somebody said, "Honey." And I woke up right now, and I reached out to reach my husband, and I found he was sitting up in bed. And I started to say something, and he clapped his hand over my mouth and said, "Hush, listen." I didn't hear anything. So pretty soon I began to get restless, and then all at once I heard a squawk. Oh, and it was coming from the chicken house, which was I don't know, 50 yards away from the house away. And so he said to me, "Do you know of anything I could get hold of to go out there? You know, the club? Is there a stove poker under the window or anything?" I tell you folks, I was paralyzed. And just then an old hen went, "Cuckoo, you know how a hen goes when they're in trouble." I couldn't, if there had been a club within arm's length, I couldn't have picked it up. I was just froze. Oh, I said, "Don't go out there." Well, he lay there a minute, and the noise just kept coming, and he jumped out of bed. Well, I grabbed the back end of his pajamas, and I hung on for dear life. He went to the back door, and we listened and listened, and I stood by him. Well, the captain continued. He says, "Something's out there. Let me go." And he got a little flashlight he had, and I saw the only husband I ever had go right out in that hot night, and it was dark. And I could see him crawling around just his outline, going around behind the chicken house to come up on the door before the thief could see. Well, it was an awful hot night, but I'll tell you, I had about the hardest chill I ever had in my life. I was just scared frantic. And the clock on the wall just tick-tock, tick-tock, and I guess it was my heart beating. Afterwards, I thought it was. And I waited and waited. And pretty soon, I heard that door slam, the chicken house door. And he said, "I've got him." Oh, I'd been scared before that. But I didn't know what to do, but I just happened to reach down to the side of the door, and there was a little boy's, what was it, a BB gun? Just a toy. But, oh, it struck me that was the weapon. So I grabbed that up and trained it out into the night, you know. And when he said, slammed the door and said, "I've got it," boy, I took out just as tight as I could go to the chicken house with that aim, you know. And I thought to myself, "Oh dear, that old chicken house is rotten. That door will never hold a thief. He'll burst down there and kill Herbert." And I can know that the great anxiety I felt even yet. And when I got out there, just before I got there, for the benefit of the thief, I said, "Honey, here's the gun, but be careful with it because it's loaded." Well, Herbert began to laugh, and he laughed, and he laughed, and he dropped his flashlight, and I didn't know what to do. I picked up the flashlight. I thought he'd lost his mind. Picked up the flashlight and trained it on the chicken house door, and there I stood. I thought every minute would be my last one because I expected just to be mauled. And I never did make out what the trouble was. But as I was looking, the door come open just a little bit, like it might have been an electric eye. And I looked down and watched a great big skunk walk off into the night. And I think, get over here and got that. That was a funny thing. Now I'm going to close with just the last of this. There is so much I'd like to tell you about. Just as I said, as if I'd like to tell you about my grandchild, too. But this was written, now this ending was written quite some time back. But I used it just the same. But this goes ahead and tells what things sold for back then, and it said, in comparison, said, and this is true. Most of this is true, but it's just been fictionized, you see, to make it safe for me to publish. But I had lost my crochet hook, a little bone crochet hook. I gave a nickel for that a long time back, and recently I lost it, and I went to the store, and I wanted one just like it. Well, I finally found it. It was 39 cents. Well, I thought to myself, just like you would, well, I had 39 cents. But when I got home, I found out when they just lied. That shows how things have started. Now God has truly smiled on this country, and this story is the story of America which has come into its own and faces unlimited possibilities ahead. It has become a great melting pot where 4 generations have absorbed persons of all nationalities, all creeds, and turned them into a great multitude of good Americans. The faint glimmer on the hill has changed to a glow of education and culture. The progress made in less than 80 years is almost unbelievable, and we marvel at all the changes as we watch our colored television and see men walking on the moon. Schools and colleges are now available to all people. Everything is changing so rapid, it's hard to keep up, and just now we're excited about our historical societies and our museums. Even my husband and I find ourselves involved in so many things that retirement does not appeal to us. All this change has brought about inflation, and I remember when I rode on a cloud when I was teaching a rural school for $45 a month. And I got a comfortable room and board for $12 and a suit for $5 or $6, and I saved money. And now the minimum teacher's wage is probably $500, and they don't seem able to save anything. Well, that was explained by the little bone hook. Now this rural electrification has brought light to all the dark corners, and the glimmer of culture has changed to a glow. The progress has been so great it amazes me. But with a bit of nostalgia, once in a while I have to shut my eyes tightly to keep the tears smoozing out. It just seems as if I hear my father saying, yes, Eunice, those are the schoolhouse lights, and the nearer we get to them and what they stand for, the brighter they will be. I couldn't know that they were a symbol of hope, of culture, and education. I couldn't know that they was a promise of a better tomorrow. Only yesterday, my grandson Bobby came in from kindergarten and followed me into the kitchen. Grandma, he informed me our teacher read us a story about Indians. Oh, that was nice, I said. Did you like it? Sure can, you responded. I wish I could see an Indian. Well, you remember the nice nurse you had when your tonsils were out? Did you mean Barbara, you want to know? Yes, the nice girl you wanted. Well, she is Indian. He was much surprised. Well, dig that, will you? You know any more? Oh, yes, I continued. Your Sunday school teacher, Miss Niles, is one-half Cherokee. And his eyes stood out like buttons. I thought he was going to insist that I was mistaken. However, at 5, one wonders about a lot of things, so he came back to me with another question. What does one-half Cherokee mean? He wanted to know. Well, in this particular case, I told him it means that her father is a white man and her mother is a Cherokee Indian girl. Lots of our friends sure have some Indian blood, even in our family. You know Uncle Dick and Aunt Shirley, and even you are. Oh, I caught myself just in time. And what, he wanted to know, as his big black eyes searched mine. Well, just now I told him you were a hungry little boy. Grab some cookies and come back tomorrow afternoon, and I'll tell you a very interesting story. Tell me now, he urged, while I'm here. Oh, Bobby, I answered, I'm terribly busy now. It's a long story, and I don't have time now. You'll have to come back later. Okay, said as he dug into the cookie jar, I'll be back. And he will. You see, I was busy because I was trying to get our lunch on the table. And then I need some time to think about the promise that I gave him. I've begun to think that it may be pretty difficult to explain to a curious little 5-year-old just what 1/32nd Cherokee means. And that is it, folks. Years old, and he got
worked in Shenandoah, Iowa for Henry Fields, and it was after his working at Henry Fields that he came to Jefferson with the nursery. And so when we were talking about this program, Mrs. Stover said to me, why don't we have Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Canton come, because we knew that he had done some paintings of Jefferson. We had had them in the museum. This is the one we have in the museum. And he has another lovely one where the two creeks cross down by Jefferson and the Chisholm Trail. People and their cattle cross there too. And I understand he's taking painting lessons, and he also is giving painting lessons in Ponca City. And so it is with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce my friend, Mr. Canton.
Well, I'm not much of a speaker, folks. The only thing I can do is just tell you a little bit about the early days of my movement.
You're going to have to get up with the speaker. We can't hear you.
Okay.
Not working.
Managed to fix this somewhere where I can. Can you hear me now? Real good?
Yeah.
Well, as Mr. Pond said, I had some really big experiences in Jefferson and Grant County trying to duplicate what Henry Field did at Shenandoah, Iowa. We came back here and I started a nursery and a flower shop, and I expect a lot of you people at times past have bought flowers from our place. The grasshoppers, dry weather, floods convinced me that I was in a poor location, so we moved to Pond Creek, and we had a flower shop there for 25 years. Then we moved to Ponca City, and I took working hard over there, and got interested in painting, and just one thing leading to something else. The painting led me into the early history of the area, and I decided I'd write a book about it for the benefit of my children and anybody else that happened to be interested. To tell you something about the old town, this is Jefferson as it was when I was a boy. I remember running up and down those streets there from school, and the town was one of the major contestants in the early days of county seat fights, that some of you old ones probably remember. But we lost out due to the high water. Flood come along to spoil the chances of the supporters of the county seat. Jefferson put up a offer there right at the time to build a courthouse. They said they would put up $15,000, which was a lot of money in those days, if they would build a courthouse in Jefferson. Another thing that transpired before that, Mr. Bain, the editor of the Jefferson Rustler, did his best to get the penitentiary located in Jefferson. So we've had some real history in that part of the country. These buildings in here, the three-story buildings, were burned out early in the years, and most of this back in here was burned out or rebuilt. This is taken mostly from photographs, and it's pretty accurate. We have a map here that deals with the Chisholm Trail. I don't know whether folks all see this or not. Can you all see that? This is a mock-up of a map that I have in my book that shows where the trail crossed the Salt Fork River, came up to the old stockade there south of where Jefferson is or was, and the trail split there. The wagon trail crossed the creeks just below the park there, or below the pond, and up over the hill. Now, our place is right up in here, and the trail was on the ridge east of us. The cattle trail, after it came up to the town site of Jefferson, went west of town, across the creek, right at the southwest corner of town, and right where the old schoolhouse stood. And then it angled north-northeast across the creek just south of where Highway 81 comes in. Highway 81 comes up just about here. Then another fork of the trail split there and came up on the west side of the creek and crossed further up. I remember when we were youngsters, we'd follow these wagon tracks in the prairie grass, very plain. And we've been down around the old stockade there, where it was. Cowboys monument, of course, there. Jefferson, at one time, the town site had been staked out up here a mile further north. Now I know that is that when we came there in prairie grass were the rock markers over half section of that land. For some reason, I suppose political maneuvering, it wasn't built there. If it had been, it probably would have been a big town and the best town in the county, because it's been out of those creek bottoms and closer to the center of the town, center of the county, and probably would have developed it. Anyhow, it wasn't. Well, when they came here, there were still a few buildings left in Sandy Point. And my father had an experience there. He was helping move one of the last ones out of that area. Got his leg broke. They had a 14 hitch on one of the buildings, wagon wheels, you know. And when the double case broke, I broke his leg. A lot of incidents like that I have tried to recall for the benefit of my youngsters. And the railroad, the other picture that I have where the railroad crossed the river here, the cattle trail, we used to come down on the west side of the railroad, cross under the bridge, and into the concrete used to become creek at that time. This picture over here is, of course, of the Rock Island Park as it was in 1914. That's where the Grand Army used to have its camps. You go down there, spend a week or a few days, depending on how much time you thought you had. They had about 100 camps along the north side of the park there, and the Grand Army furnished those. patrol, and you go there and camp out. And go to the entertainment, they had bands, speakers from everywhere. I think I remember particularly Haskell, Gore, and many others along about that time. We used to have some interesting experiences as kids. Right along about in here was the old wrestler officer, later the review office, and close there was a gap in the building about 20 feet wide, and all of the arguments from school were generally settled back at the criminal office. This picture shows about 2/3 of the town. East of the railroad track, there were rooming houses and blacksmith shops and other enterprises. And then west here, this is facing east. On the west here, on this side, there were a drugstore, harness shop, livery stables, and over here there was lumber yards and stone yards. Brother, it's a schoolhouse. So it was quite a little job to get as much onto that one picture showing things all as it did. The county seat fight was quite an interesting deal. It kept all of the livery stable boys and bus boys busy hauling the contestant supporters around over the county trying to get as many votes as they could. The way I have it sized up was Pond Creek was just about 5 miles from the south side of the county, and Jefferson was in the close middle there, and Medford was north of the center. They, of course, contested back and forth. The boys on the south side that said that the most population was there. The county seat would go to them. And as a matter of divide and conquer, the people on the north side of the county held pretty solid together and outvoted the other two. They got the majority. You notice here this cotton wagon there. That's something that most of the younger generation don't know, that this used to be a cotton growing area. But of course that didn't last too long. I think there was a gin at Kremlin, if I'm not mistaken, and they hauled their cotton there. North of where we lived, there was a man that had about 40 acres of cotton. Of course they didn't have any cars, they hauled them in those cotton wagons. Have any questions you'd like to pose? Maybe I can answer, maybe I can't. No, I'm just working on it. It's something I've been working on for a year or so. I thought probably somebody might ask that question. I